I never thought the sound of a bus engine could feel like a heartbeat. But there I was, sitting in the last row of a Greyhound heading to Houston, clutching a plastic bag with a change of clothes and a paper napkin with my cousin's address scribbled in shaky ink. The windows were foggy from the cold air hitting the glass, but I stared through them anyway, watching the landscape blur into something unfamiliar and endless. I was 22, no English, no documents, and no idea what it really meant to start over in a place that didn't want you. I still remember the first breath I took when I stepped out of that bus station. It tasted like smog, oil, and something burnt in the air. Not the freedom I had imagined, more like fear, the kind that sits in your stomach and refuses to move. There were people everywhere, walking fast, talking loud, not looking at each other. I was invisible, and I hadn't even been there 10 minutes. My cousin didn't show up. His phone was off. I waited on the curb for 6 hours, my legs numb and my eyes scanning every car that slowed down. At one point, a man in a white pickup asked if I needed a ride. I lied, said someone was on their way. He laughed and drove off yelling something about illegals. That word, illegal. It hits like a slap, as if your existence is a crime, as if surviving makes you guilty. That night, I slept behind a dumpster behind a taco truck. The concrete was cold. My backpack was my pillow. I kept my shoes on, scared someone might steal them. At some point, I cried, quietly, not for attention, not even out of sadness. It was just the body's way of saying it had reached its limit. That was my first night in the land of opportunity. The next morning, I walked for hours, following the sun like it might lead me somewhere better. I passed restaurants, gas stations, construction sites. Every time I asked for work, I got the same answer. No English, no papers, no job. Some didn't even answer. They just waved me away like I was trash on the sidewalk. I ended up at a car wash. The owner was Honduran. He looked at me, at my cracked hands and dusty jeans, and asked one question. "Can you work hard?" I nodded. That was all it took. My job was to dry cars in the back, away from customers, out of sight. No one spoke to me except to yell when I missed a spot. I was paid $30 a day, cash, no breaks, no water, just sweat, sun, and silence. I'd stare at the customers laughing in their air-conditioned cars while I wiped down their windshields, wondering if they ever saw me, or if to them, I was just part of the hose. At night, I shared a room with 4 other men, all of us immigrants, all of us broken in different ways. The room smelled like feet, bleach, and wet clothes. We took turns sleeping on the mattress, the others on the floor. We didn't talk much, just grunted, passed bottles of aspirin, and borrowed toothpaste without asking. Survival doesn't leave much room for friendship. Every night before I slept, I thought about my parents, my little sister, the promise I had made to send money, to make life better. Back home, they believed I was doing great, that I had a job, a room, maybe even a car. I let them believe that, because the truth would have shattered them, and because, if I admitted how bad it really was, I might have lost the only thing keeping me going. In those early weeks, I learned more about pain than I ever thought possible. Not just physical pain, like the blisters on my feet, or the sunburn peeling off my neck, but the pain of being nobody, of being stared at like you're dangerous, of people moving their purses closer when you sit near them on the bus, of kids laughing at your accent, of hearing the word immigrant like it's an insult. And yet, through all that, I held on, because I had to, because going back wasn't an option, because even humiliation felt better than hunger, because I believed that maybe, just maybe, one day this place would see me as a human being. Not a problem, not a burden, just someone trying to live. If you've ever felt invisible, like no matter how hard you try, the world only sees what you are not, you're not alone. This space is for people like us, people who've had to fight twice as hard just to be seen. So if this story touches something in you, I invite you to share your experience in the comments. Write, "I exist and I matter," because you do, and your story deserves to be heard. And if you want to hear more stories like this, from people who've lived it, who've survived it, who are still standing, subscribe to the channel. Your presence here makes all the difference. The first time I walked into that restaurant, the smell of garlic and burnt cheese hit me like a wall. The kitchen was alive, pans clanged, orders were shouted, steam rose from boiling water, and in the middle of it all stood Jason, tall, blonde, confident. He didn't smile when he saw me, just pointed to the corner where I would be working, the dish pit, a cramped space in the back with stacks of dirty plates, broken tiles on the floor, and a sink that never quite drained right. That was my world now. They gave me an apron stained with things I didn't want to identify. No introduction, no welcome. Just gloves and an order to move faster. I washed dishes from 4 in the afternoon until midnight, my fingers wrinkled and raw from hot water and cheap detergent. My back screamed from standing for hours. No one asked my name. No one cared where I was from. I was just, hey you, or worse, the dishwasher. Jason made sure I remembered that every day. He was the type of manager who liked to watch you struggle. If I dropped a plate, he'd announce it to the entire staff. If I was slow, he'd sigh loudly and shake his head like I had ruined his night. Once, I asked him if I could take a 5-minute break. He looked at me and said, "You people don't get breaks. You're lucky to even be here." That was the moment I realized he didn't see me as a worker. He saw me as something less. There were others in the kitchen too. Cooks, servers, hosts. Most of them ignored me. Some laughed when Jason made jokes about immigrants. Others joined in. "These guys are like cockroaches," one of the cooks said once. "They survive anything." Everyone laughed. I didn't. Not because it wasn't funny, but because it was true. I had survived worse, and I would survive this too. But survival doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. It does. Every comment chips away at your spirit. Every ignored greeting reminds you of your place. Every shift felt like a test I wasn't allowed to pass. And yet I showed up every single day. Never late, never missed. Because this job, as humiliating as it was the only thing standing between my family and hunger. The irony is that I was good at it. I worked fast. I kept the kitchen clean. I even fixed the broken sink one night when it flooded the prep area. But none of that mattered. Not to Jason. To him, I was just another immigrant taking up space. He made sure I knew it. "You know you'll never move up here, right?" he said once while I was scrubbing burnt cheese off a tray. "No one wants a dishwasher with an accent running the place." He smiled like he had done me a favor by telling the truth. I wanted to believe that people like Jason were rare. But the more I worked, the more I realized he was just saying what others were too polite to say out loud. At a staff meeting, the owner once joked about hiring more undocumented workers because they don't complain and work harder. Everyone laughed. I stood in the back, invisible, holding a mop. But I wasn't just invisible to them. I was becoming invisible to myself. I stopped looking in mirrors. I stopped calling home as much. What was I supposed to say? That I spent my days being treated like a stain? That I was beginning to believe I had no value outside of how fast I could clean a pan? My coworkers had lives outside of work. They talked about weekend, trips, dates, hobbies. I didn't have weekends. I didn't have dates. My hobby was survival. After every shift, I walked home in the dark, counting coins in my pocket, hoping I had enough for rice and eggs. My fingers would still smell like bleach, my shirt soaked in grease, but I was used to it by then. Pain becomes normal when you have no other option. One night, I saw Jason at the bar with a group of friends. I was taking out the trash. He didn't notice me. He was laughing, telling some story about the funny illegal in the kitchen. I knew he was talking about me. I could see it in his face. And for a second, I felt something shift inside me. Not rage, not even sadness, just emptiness. The realization that to him, I wasn't a person. I was a punchline. I never fought back, not once. Not because I was weak, but because fighting back meant risking everything. One call to immigration, one false report, that's all it would take. People like Jason knew that. That's why they said what they said. They knew we couldn't afford to respond. But I remember everything. The way they looked at me, the way they laughed, the way they pretended I didn't exist until they needed something cleaned. I remember it all, and I carried it like bricks in my chest. Heavy, constant. But one day, those bricks would build something stronger. I didn't know it yet, but it was coming. If you've ever been made to feel small for where you came from, for your accent, your skin, your roots, your story matters, share it with me. Leave a comment with the words, "My dignity is not negotiable." Let them echo louder than their cruelty. And if you believe these voices deserve to be heard, subscribe to the channel. Together, we're building something they can't ignore. It started with something simple. A cup of coffee left by the sink, a short smile in the middle of chaos. Jason began to treat me differently. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe he was just being polite. Maybe he felt guilty for the way he had talked to me before. But the small gestures became more frequent. A compliment on how fast I worked. A quiet thank you when no one was watching. It was strange, confusing, but in a place where kindness was rare, Even a drop of it felt like rain after a drought. He started talking to me more often, asking questions about where I came from, what my life was like before I came here. His tone was curious, almost soft. I told him little pieces of the truth, that I came from a small town, that my mother made the best tamales in the world, that I used to help my father fix old cars in the yard. He listened, really listened, and for a moment, I forgot who he was. He offered me rides home after late shifts. At first, I refused, but one night it was raining hard and the buses had stopped running. He insisted. "Come on, man, it's dangerous to walk this late." His voice sounded sincere. I accepted. I remember sitting in his car, drenched and nervous, the sound of the rain, hitting the windshield like 1,000 small drums. He asked me if I liked living here. I said I didn't know. He smiled and said, "You'll get used to it. Everyone does." That night, when he dropped me off, he waited until I got inside before driving away. No one had ever done that for me before, and it was that small act that cracked something inside me, because when you're starved of kindness, even manipulation can taste like love. Over the next few weeks, we grew closer. He started sitting with me during breaks, even if it meant getting teased by other employees. He brought me lunch sometimes, saying he made too much. We'd talk about music, food, life. He'd laugh at my accent in a way that felt almost affectionate, and I laughed too, because I wanted to believe he meant no harm. I wanted to believe someone saw me. Then one evening, after everyone else had left, he kissed me. It was quick, unexpected, but not unwelcome. My heart raced, my hands trembled. For the first time since I came to this country, I felt chosen, wanted, seen. I didn't know that being seen by the wrong person can sometimes be the most dangerous thing of all. The next morning, things felt different. He was colder in front of others, careful to keep his distance. But when we were alone, his eyes said something else. It was like living two different realities, one where I was his secret and one where I was his servant. I told myself it was fine, that this was just the way things were, that love didn't need to be fair, only real. For a while I believed that, until the mask started slipping. His affection became unpredictable. Some days he'd hold my hand, other days he'd mock my accent again, as if reminding me who I was. When I tried to talk about the future, about maybe finding a place of our own, his face hardened. "You're getting too comfortable," he said once, his voice sharp. "You should remember where you came from." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he wasn't. That was the first time he called me a name I won't repeat, the kind of word that burns even when it's whispered. I walked away that night, but the next day, he apologized, said he was drunk, said he didn't mean it, and I wanted to believe him because I needed to. Because after years of loneliness, it was easier to forgive cruelty than to face silence again. One night, while we were closing the restaurant, he said something that shattered everything. "You know, you should be grateful. Guys like me don't date people like you." I froze. He smiled like he'd said something funny. I realized then that to him, I wasn't a person. I was a secret thrill, a story he could tell his friends one day, when I was gone. But I wasn't gone yet. The next week, I was called into the office by the owner. They said there had been a report of theft, bottles of wine missing from the storage room. I was confused, scared. They showed me a paper with my name on it. My hands shook. Jason stood in the corner, silent. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. I already knew. He was the one who reported it. They fired me that same day. No evidence, no questions, just one man's word against mine. I walked out into the cold night, holding a garbage bag with my things, my uniform, my shoes, my last paycheck. Jason didn't follow me. He didn't even say goodbye. The only sound I heard was the door closing behind me. I spent that night sitting on a bench outside a convenience store, staring at my reflection in the glass. My eyes were swollen. My chest was heavy. I thought about all the times he called me baby when no one was around, and dishwasher when everyone was. I thought about how love shouldn't feel like humiliation, but somehow I had mistaken one for the other. In that silence, I realized something I should have known long before. People like Jason don't destroy you all at once. They do it slowly, with smiles, with sweet words, with small cuts you don't feel until you're bleeding out. And by the time you notice, it's too late. I walked home that night without looking back at the restaurant. My body felt numb, but inside me, something new was forming. Not hate, not even revenge, just a quiet promise that someday I would no longer be the man who let others define his worth. If you've ever loved someone who made you feel less, who made you question your own value, I want you to know something. You are not what they said you are. You are not your accent or your papers or your pain. Leave a comment below with the words, "I know my worth." Let this be your reminder. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, subscribe to the channel, because every voice that rises from silence makes it harder for cruelty to win. When you lose everything in one day, it doesn't feel like a storm. It feels like silence. A silence so loud it drowns out your thoughts. That's what it was like walking out of that restaurant for the last time. No explanation, no chance to defend myself, just a cheap trash bag in my hand and a world that suddenly felt too big, too cold, and too empty. I didn't go back to the apartment. I couldn't face the looks, the questions. I had been staying with 3 other men in a 1-bedroom unit we barely afforded together. They were good guys, quiet, hardworking. But in that moment, I needed no eyes on me, no pity, just space. I walked for hours, past closed laundromats, darkened storefronts, fast food joints that reeked of grease and dreams gone stale. My body was moving, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. I sat at a bus stop until the sun came up. The world around me kept moving, indifferent to the fact that mine had just collapsed. A woman walked her dog. A kid with a backpack ran to catch the school bus. A man in a suit drank coffee from a cup that probably cost more than I earned in a day. I felt like I was watching life from the outside, like a ghost. I finally made my way back to the apartment. Quietly, I slipped into the shower without speaking. Let the hot water run over me until my skin turned red, but it couldn't wash away the shame. I wrapped myself in a towel and stared at the mirror. My eyes looked sunken. My lips were cracked. I barely recognized the man looking back at me. What hurt most wasn't the betrayal. It was the realization that I had let myself believe I was more than what they saw me as. And now I didn't know who I was anymore. I texted my mother later that day. Just a simple, "I'm okay. Work is hard." She responded with voice messages, as she always did, telling me to eat well, to save money, to not forget to pray. I listened to them with my eyes closed, imagining her voice echoing in our small kitchen back home, imagining the smell of masa cooking, the laughter of my nephews in the background. I wanted to believe that place still existed for me, but even that felt far away now. Over the next few days, I tried to find work. I walked into restaurants, gas stations, warehouses. I said I had experience. I said I could start immediately. Most of them didn't even let me finish. Some asked for papers. Some just looked me up and down and said they weren't hiring. One man laughed and said, "We already got too many of you." I didn't ask what he meant. I already knew. At night, I stayed quiet in the apartment. My roommates noticed. One of them, Pedro, asked if I was okay. I nodded, but inside, I was unraveling. I started sleeping less, eating less, waking up with panic squeezing my chest. I'd pace the apartment at night, pretending to go to the kitchen just to avoid lying in bed with my thoughts. Shame has a way of sinking into your bones, making your own skin feel foreign. I called home again a few days later. My sister answered. She was in a rush. She asked if I had sent the money yet, that Alejandro needed school supplies, that the roof was leaking again. I said I was working on it. She didn't ask how I was. Not once, just said she'd be waiting and hung up. I stared at the phone in my hand. I had sent thousands over the years, month after month, no matter how little I kept for myself. And now, when I was falling apart, the only thing they wanted from me was more. I couldn't blame them. Not fully. I had built that image, the strong one, the lucky one, the one who made it. I never told them about the nights I cried myself to sleep on the floor, about the days I skipped meals to send money back, about the humiliation I swallowed daily just to keep going. I made it look easy, and now they thought it was. That money came from trees and not from blood. I started skipping meals again, not out of choice this time, but necessity. I rationed bread and canned beans. I stopped taking the bus, walking instead, even if it meant miles in the Texas heat. I looked for day labor jobs on street corners, competing with dozens of other men desperate for anything. Most days, I came back empty-handed, sunburned, exhausted, ashamed. Then one day, I saw Jason again. I was walking near the strip mall where the restaurant was. It was late afternoon. The sun was beginning to dip, casting a golden haze over the concrete. He was outside, laughing with a group of people, dressed sharp like always. He saw me. His smile faded. He looked away quickly, as if I was a shadow he had hoped never to see again. I stood still, watching him, not with anger, but with clarity. He would go home, sleep well, wake up to a job he didn't fear, live a life untouched by what he did to me. and I would keep disappearing unless I chose not to. That night, I pulled out an old notebook I had carried with me since leaving home. It was full of numbers, reminders, names, but on the last page, I started something new. I wrote, "This is not how my story ends." And then I wrote it again, over and over, until my hand ached, until I believed it. Because even if no one believed in me, I had to. If you've ever felt discarded, used, invisible, I want to tell you something I had to learn the hard way. Your worth is not measured by the jobs you lose or the people who abandon you. Your value is not tied to your silence or your suffering. If this part of the story resonated with you, leave a comment that says, "I am not disposable." Say it for yourself. Say it for everyone who has ever been told they were less. And if you want to be part of a space where these truths are honored, subscribe to this channel. Here, you are seen, you are heard, you belong. The day my life began to shift didn't feel like a miracle. It started like every other, hot, slow, and hopeless. I was sitting on the curb outside a supermarket, arms wrapped around my knees, watching a mother pull her child away from me as if poverty was contagious. I had $10 to my name, no job, no dignity left to sell. I hadn't eaten anything solid in 2 days, just tap water and pride swallowed down in silence. It was late afternoon when Claudine noticed me. I had seen her before, a Haitian woman, maybe in her 50s, working at the self-service laundromat down the street. She always wore a headscarf and carried herself with the kind of grace that only women who've survived too much can manage. That day, she passed by holding a bag of laundry. She didn't speak to me, just looked like she was seeing something everyone else refused to see. 15 minutes later, she came back. In her hands was a styrofoam container, still warm. She handed it to me without saying a word. Inside was rice and beans, a boiled egg, 2 slices of fried plantain. It was the first hot meal I had tasted in days. I ate slowly, almost reverently, not just because I was hungry, but because it felt like kindness. And when kindness is rare, it becomes sacred. The next day, I passed by the laundromat and saw her mopping the floor. I tried to return the favor. I offered to take the mop, to help fold clothes. She raised an eyebrow and said in her thick accent, "You can mop, but you better do it right." That was the beginning of something I didn't have a name for, a kind of trust, a kind of quiet alliance between 2 people who understood what it meant to be outsiders in a country that only half pretended to tolerate you. Over the next few weeks, she let me hang around, cleaning windows, sweeping the sidewalk, taking out trash. She never called it a job, but every other day, she slipped a $5 or $10 bill into my pocket, pretending she didn't notice. It wasn't just about the money, it was the sense of purpose, that I mattered, that I wasn't just drifting like a plastic bag in the wind. One night, she handed me a flyer. It was handwritten, torn at the edges. Restaurant looking for dishwasher. No papers asked. It was from a Caribbean place across town. Claudine looked at me and said, "You better show up early. People fight for jobs like this." I nodded. I didn't sleep that night. My clothes were still stained, but I washed them twice in the laundromat and hung them to dry behind the building. I borrowed a pair of shoes from one of the guys I was still crashing with. They were too small, but I shoved my feet in anyway. I got there before the sun came up. A line had already formed, men and women standing in silence. Some old, some young, all tired, all desperate. When the doors opened, I walked in with my heart pounding like it was trying to escape my chest. The owner was a short Dominican man named Ruben. He asked if I had experience. I said yes. I didn't mention how my last job ended. He looked me over, then said, "You start tomorrow. Bring your hands. That's all I need." I almost cried. The next morning, I was there before anyone else. The kitchen was smaller, hotter, louder, but there was something different in the air. The cook spoke Spanish and Creole and even a bit of Portuguese. There were jokes, laughter, music playing softly in the background. No one asked me where I was from. No one mocked my accent. They just showed me where the sink was and said, "Keep it moving, hermano." It was brutal work. 12-hour shifts, non-stop dishes, piles of grease-caked pans. But I didn't care. I was earning again, standing on my own 2 feet. Every night I went home with fingers like prunes and shoulders aching, but I slept like a child, because for the first time in months, I felt human again. I saved every penny I could, ate the free staff meal, drank water instead of soda, walked to work. Slowly, I started to build something again. I bought a new pair of shoes, a second-hand phone. I even sent $20 to my mother, just so she would know I was still alive. She cried in her voice message, said God must be watching me. I wanted to believe that too. Claudine came by one Saturday with a basket of food, bread, chicken, plantains. She said nothing, just handed it to me and walked away. That was her way. No lectures, no pity, just action. She taught me more about dignity than any sermon ever could. One evening, after a long shift, I stayed behind to help one of the cooks prep for the next day. He asked me why I worked so hard. I told him the truth, that I had been stepped on, that I had been lied to, that I had been made to feel like trash, and that every plate I washed was a way of cleaning a little bit of that pain. He nodded, then said something I'll never forget. They don't get to decide who you are. You do. That night, I walked home with my head higher than usual. The streetlights felt less harsh, the city less cruel. I passed the old restaurant where I used to work. Jason wasn't there, but I stood across the street for a while, just looking at it, not with hate, not even with sadness, just with clarity. That part of my life was done, and I had survived it. If you've ever had someone extend a hand when you were at your lowest, someone who didn't ask for anything in return, honor that moment. Share your gratitude in the comments by writing, "Kindness saved me." And if you believe in stories that speak truth without shame, that offer light even in the darkest hours, subscribe to this channel. You matter here. You are never alone here. The days began to blur. Work, sleep, a rhythm of survival that left little space for dreams, but just enough for hope. I never missed a shift. Even when my feet were blistered or my back felt like it would snap, I was afraid that if I stopped, even for a moment, everything I had started rebuilding would fall apart. So I pushed through every ache, every drop of sweat, every moment when I wanted to scream, but instead just whispered, "Keep going." The kitchen at the new restaurant became my world. The steam, the knives clanging against cutting boards, the shouting in 3 different languages, the heat from the grill that never seemed to turn off. It was chaos, but it was also family in a way. No one cared what you had done before. What mattered was whether you showed up, whether you worked, whether you respected the fire everyone else was standing in. I started to learn more than just how to wash dishes. I learned how to prep ingredients. I learned the difference between slicing and dicing. I learned what made jerk chicken taste like home for some of the cooks, and how plantains could be soft or crispy depending on how you cut them. I didn't ask for more responsibility, but the cooks saw me. They saw how I watched, how I listened, and little by little, they pulled me into the process, not with words, just with a look, a nod, a gesture toward a cutting board. Outside of work, I kept to myself. My world was still small, and I wanted it that way. I didn't go out. I didn't make many friends. I didn't trust easily anymore. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the city was asleep, I found something else to hold on to. A second-hand laptop that Claudine had helped me buy for $20. The screen was cracked. The charger had to be bent a certain way to work, but it was mine. And through it, I found the world again. I started watching YouTube videos about English, about business, about how to open an LLC. I watched documentaries about people who had nothing and built something anyway. I didn't understand every word, but I understood enough. I took notes. I paused and rewound. I filled a notebook with vocabulary, with ideas, with numbers. This was my version of school. My classroom was a mattress on the floor, and my teacher was my own desperation. Every week, I set aside a few dollars. It wasn't much. Sometimes only 5, sometimes 10, but it was sacred. I kept it in a tin box under my bed, labeled someday. It wasn't just money. It was the belief that someday I would be more than a dishwasher, that someday I would own something with my name on it. Not a fake name, not a borrowed one, mine. I kept sending money home too, not as much as before, but enough to keep the lights on, enough to keep my family from worrying too much. They still didn't know everything. I didn't tell them about the nights I couldn't sleep because of nightmares, about the way my hands cramped from hours of scrubbing, about how some days I felt like I was wearing a costume just to blend in. They didn't need to carry that pain. I had learned how to carry it alone. One day at work, one of the cooks had an emergency and didn't show up. Ruben, the owner, looked around and said, "Can anyone cut onions without crying like a baby?" I raised my hand. Everyone laughed, but he handed me a knife anyway. That day, I didn't just wash dishes. I chopped onions, peppers, and garlic. I helped season the rice. I worked next to the head cook, and when the day ended, Ruben patted me on the back and said, "You did good." That night, I walked home with sore arms and onion juice in my eyes, but a fire in my chest. A fire that said, maybe I wasn't invisible anymore. Maybe I was becoming something more. I started waking up earlier, getting to work before everyone else, helping clean the prep station, asking questions, watching hands, not just hearing words. My English was getting better, my confidence too. Not because the world had changed, but because I had stopped waiting for permission to grow. I began writing down everything I learned. How long chicken should marinate, what temperature keeps rice fluffy, which cleaning supplies cost less but lasted longer. I was building something, even if no one else could see it yet. A map, a plan, a dream that was no longer just in my head. On my days off, I started walking through neighborhoods I used to avoid. I looked at signs, for lease, for rent, for sale. I imagined my name on them. I memorized phone numbers I couldn't call yet. I sat in parks and watched people eat food from restaurants that used to feel out of reach to me. And I thought, what if one day someone eats something I made and feels like they belong? The loneliness didn't disappear. The fear didn't either, but it became quieter, like a voice that used to scream now only whispered. And in that space, I found something else growing. Not revenge, not anger, but a strange kind of peace. The peace that comes when you realize you are no longer what happened to you. You are what you choose to become after it. If you are in a season of rebuilding, if your hands are cracked and your heart is tired, but you are still standing, still dreaming, leave a comment that says, I am growing in the dark. Let that be your reminder. And if this story speaks to the part of you that refuses to give up, subscribe to this channel, because your journey matters, your strength matters, and every step you take forward is a story worth telling. There is something sacred about the quiet hours before sunrise, the city still asleep, the streets breathing slowly. That was the time I began to feel closest to myself, when the noise of the world faded, and all that remained was the sound of my footsteps on concrete and the soft hum of hope, whispering that maybe things were about to change. I had started going to the local farmers market every Sunday, not to buy, but to observe, to study how small businesses worked, how people moved, what they sold, how they spoke to customers. Some of the vendors knew I wasn't there to shop. They saw me standing in the back, notebook in hand, eyes scanning every detail. But no one pushed me away. One of them, a man named Elijah, who sold Caribbean spices, eventually came over and said, "You taking notes on how to steal my secrets or how to build your own?" I smiled and said, "Maybe both." He laughed, and just like that, a new door opened. Elijah had been running his stand for 8 years. He started with a folding table and a few jars of homemade pepper sauce. Now his tent was always crowded, his labels professional, his setup clean and eye-catching. He spoke with pride, but never arrogance. I told him I wanted to open something one day. Maybe a food cart, maybe a small kitchen, something that smelled like home. He didn't ask where home was. He just said, "Start small, start now." Those 3 words followed me everywhere. I began experimenting during my nights off. I'd buy cheap ingredients from the dollar store, rice, flour, oil, beans, whatever I could stretch. I used Claudine's kitchen when she wasn't home. I tested seasoning blends. I wrote down measurements. I made mistakes and wrote those down too. I treated that little stove like it was $1 million kitchen, because to me, it was. I made empanadas first, then tamales, then jerk chicken inspired by the cooks I worked with. I packed leftovers in plastic containers and handed them to co-workers the next day. "Just try it," I'd say, pretending it wasn't a test, but it was. I watched their faces. I listened to their reactions. Every nod, every smile, every "damn, that's good," felt like oxygen. One of the servers at work, a Dominican woman named Maria, took a bite of my rice and said, "Why are you still back there washing dishes?" I laughed, but that question hit deep, because I knew the answer. Fear, lack of papers, lack of money, but mostly the weight of a belief I had carried for too long, that someone like me wasn't allowed to dream that big. But something was changing. Every compliment chipped away at that old belief. Every empty container someone handed back to me reminded me that my hands were good for more than scrubbing, that they could create, that they could build, that they could feed. Elijah invited me to help him at the market one Sunday. Showed up early, helped him unload, watched how he set up his space. He talked about permits, vendor fees, health inspections. Things that once felt overwhelming now started to feel possible. Complicated, yes, but not impossible. He even let me bring a small tray of empanadas to give away. Just samples, just to see. By noon, they were gone. People asked where they could buy more. I didn't have an answer yet, but their questions planted a seed. A vendor 2 tents down gave me a flyer for a community workshop on starting small food businesses. I signed up the same night. It was free, held at the public library. I sat in the back with a notebook and took in every word like it was gold. I learned about food safety, branding, pricing. I learned about how to register a business in Texas even without a green card, that there were community kitchens I could rent by the hour, that there were grants available for immigrant entrepreneurs. I went home with my head spinning, heart racing. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up designing a logo on a free website and watching videos on how to write a business plan. It still felt unreal, but also closer than ever. Claudine noticed. She said I was walking different, standing taller. I didn't even realize it until she said it. I had carried so much shame for so long that I forgot what it felt like to stand up without apologizing for taking space. Then came the day that would mark the true beginning. Ruben, the restaurant owner, pulled me aside after a shift and asked if I wanted to take over lunch on Tuesdays. Just 1 hour, just for staff. "You're always cooking back there anyway," he said. "Might as well let them pay for it." I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He said I could keep all the tips, use the kitchen, test it out, no pressure. The next Tuesday, I made arroz con pollo and black beans. I served it in foil trays with plastic forks. I didn't look at anyone while they ate, just stood near the sink, pretending to clean. But when I heard the first, "Yo, this is fire," my knees almost buckled. Not because I was surprised, but because for the first time, I let myself believe I deserved that praise. The tips came in folded bills and handshakes. It wasn't much, maybe $60 total, but it felt like $1 million. I went home that night and wrote in my notebook, "This is the start." I kept doing it every week. The meals got better. More people joined in. Ruben started joking about adding a dish to the menu, but I wasn't ready for that yet. I was still building, still learning, still healing, but I was moving forward, finally. If you have a gift you've buried under fear, if there's something inside you waiting to come alive, say it in the comments with the words, "I am building something real." And if you want to keep walking this path with me through all the mess and all the miracles, subscribe to this channel. We rise together, one story at a time. I walked into the office early that morning. My arms still ached from last night's shift. I'd scrubbed nearly 100 pans until my fingers were raw and pink, but there was something new in the air. Not the usual dread, but a subtle shift. The owner, Ruben, sat behind his desk waiting for me. He didn't laugh. He didn't shake his head. He just looked at me and asked if I wanted to take over Tuesday lunch for the staff. I felt my stomach drop, not because I thought I couldn't, but because I realized how much this moment mattered. All those nights scraping by, all the constant fear that someone would notice I didn't belong here. It had led to this. That Tuesday, I arrived early. The station was spotless. I laid out my ingredients: rice, chicken thighs, black beans, garlic, cumin, fresh cilantro. The kitchen smelled different when I was in charge, like promise. Workers filtered in, expecting nothing special for lunch. They sat down, set their trays, looked at me at the edge of the room. I didn't speak much. I was careful with my words, but I let the food speak. I seasoned the rice with care. I browned the chicken until the skin was crisp. I stirred the beans slowly. I served it all in foil trays because that's what we had. And when the first person dug in and nodded, I felt something I'd forgotten: pride. One of the waiters came by and said someone just asked him where the new dish came from. "Hey man," he said, "this is fire." I heard it behind me, like a wave. I almost didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I knew what it meant. For the first time, someone outside my small circle recognized me not as the dishwasher, not as the immigrant no one expects much from, but as the person who cooked something they wanted to eat. I went home that night and wrote, "This is the start," in my notebook. It felt risque at the time because I still had so far to go. I still had to pay rent. I still worried about papers. I still woke up trembling sometimes. But for the first time, I allowed myself to believe I was no longer just breaking even. I was inching forward. The next few weeks, I kept doing it. Tuesday lunch became a quiet ritual. The menu improved. People started asking ahead of time what I was going to make. Some of the cooks teased me about adding chef to my job title. I laughed, because here was a twist. I was still washing dishes, still lugging supplies, still the guy no one noticed. But in the same shift, I was creating something people pointed to and asked about. That duality was heavy, but I learned to carry it. In those weeks, I started noticing small changes. The head cook asked me to prep a batch of jerk chicken because I had done such a good job last time. I spent a Saturday off watching YouTube videos about marinade techniques and presentation. I learned how to plate quickly. I borrowed plates from the restaurant when they weren't used. I practiced layering the chicken, rice, beans, cilantro. I practiced until I didn't care how late I stayed. I practiced because I wanted to matter. 1. Thursday, Ruben called me into his office again. He said that one of the servers told him the special was getting more attention than the regular menu. He asked if I'd be willing to include my dish on the rotating menu on Fridays. I froze. My heart pounded. The fears sneaked in. What if they change their mind? What if I screw it up? But I said yes, because the possibility weighed more than the fear. That Friday, I arrived early. I set up a small station. I wrote out paper menus that said, Chef Miguel's Caribbean Fusion Special, even though, at that moment, I still wore the same uniform and apron as everyone else. When the first guest ordered it, I delivered with purpose. The food was good, no magic, but it came from someone who had been told he wasn't worth much. The guest smiled. He told me the chicken was perfect. The woman next to him said the rice had a touch of lime she couldn't quite place, and she liked it. I watched them. I listened. Their satisfaction was validation. In the back of the restaurant, Jason walked by. He glanced at me. His look said nothing, but I felt every word he didn't say. He saw me standing in the kitchen, not behind the scenes, and I wasn't invisible anymore. The awkwardness between us ranged from cold to curious, but I didn't look away. I kept moving. Walking home that night, I realized something heavy. Success is quieter than I thought. The moment when you prove your value doesn't come with trumpets. It comes with a nod, a question. Where did this come from? It comes with you noticing that you are the answer. And I wasn't there yet, but I was closer, much closer. If you've ever been the one told you will never rise, you owe it to yourself to cook your own path. Write in the comments, I create my worth. And if you're ready to step into the space you've been denied, subscribe to this channel. We're showing up together. It happened gradually, like light creeping under a door. One morning, I woke up and realized I no longer whispered apologies to the world when I walked outside. I didn't rush past mirrors avoiding my reflection. I didn't flinch every time someone asked me where I was from. Something in me had shifted. I was no longer trying to hide my accent or make myself smaller in rooms where I once felt unworthy. I was no longer performing for acceptance. I was finally allowing myself to exist. My identity as an immigrant, once something I tucked away like a secret shame, started to feel like a badge of honor. The dishes I cooked weren't just food. They were memory. They were language. They were survival. Each spice was a fragment of where I came from. Each plate a declaration that I belonged, not in spite of my roots, but because of them. One afternoon, I brought in a new dish for staff lunch. Pastelitos filled with sweet plantain and cheese, a nod to my childhood. When I placed them on the table, I expected maybe a few polite compliments. But something unexpected happened. Maria, one of the servers, took a bite and closed her eyes. Then she whispered, "This tastes like my abuela's." That was the highest praise I could have received, not because she liked it, but because it took her somewhere safe, somewhere sacred. That's when I understood. Food doesn't just nourish the body. It heals. It connects. It reminds us that we come from somewhere, even when we are made to feel like we don't belong anywhere. I started including small handwritten notes with the food, short phrases in Spanish, proverbs my mother used to say, lyrics from old songs. One day, I wrote, "Ser raíz es resistir," which means, to be rooted is to resist. Ruben noticed. He asked what it meant. I told him. He nodded and said, "Put that on your business card when you start your place." I laughed. But that night, I opened my notebook and wrote it down. Not just as a dream, but as a truth. I was rooted. And because of that, I had survived storms that would have torn others apart. There was a strength in knowing who I was, in no longer needing to prove anything to people who had never lived a single day in my skin. I started reclaiming my name, Miguel, not Mike, not M, just Miguel. I made sure people pronounced it correctly, not because I wanted to be difficult, but because I finally believed I deserved to be seen as whole. The more I embraced my roots, the more others began to open up. One of the cooks, a quiet man named Roberto, told me he hadn't spoken to his father in years because of shame. He didn't tell me what had happened. He didn't need to. We understood each other without details. We were all carrying something heavy, and for the first time, that weight didn't make me feel alone. It made me feel connected. I started playing Latin music during cleanup hours. The rhythm lifted the mood. Some people danced while sweeping. Others hummed while stacking dishes. It was a small rebellion against the silence that had once defined our shifts. It made the kitchen feel like a space of life, not just labor. I even brought in a photo of my family. It was faded and bent at the edges, taken years ago in front of our tiny house. My mother smiling, her arm around my little sister, my younger self standing barefoot in a shirt too big for my frame. I pinned it near my prep station. At first I felt nervous, but over time, I realized no one judged me for it. Some even asked about it, and when I told them, their eyes softened. We all had homes we missed, lives we left behind. This wasn't just about food anymore. This was about identity, about reclaiming the parts of myself I had once buried in order to survive. I no longer wanted to just exist in America. I wanted to exist as myself, fully, loudly, proudly. There were still hard days, days when fear crept back in, when I doubted whether I could keep this momentum. But every time that happened, I touched the necklace my mother had sent me years ago. A small wooden cross, worn smooth from years of clutching it in silence. It reminded me who I was before the world tried to tell me otherwise. One night, after a long shift, I sat on the back steps of the restaurant, watching the moon rise over the alley. The air smelled like garlic and smoke. My apron was stained, my hands rough, but I felt rich, not in money, but in memory, in meaning, in the realization that I had built something that could not be taken from me. If you have ever hidden parts of yourself to be accepted, if you have ever silenced your name or your story just to fit in, I invite you to break that silence now. Leave a comment that says, "I honor where I come from." Let it be your declaration. Let it be your healing. And if this story speaks to a part of you that is still reclaiming its roots, subscribe to this channel. Here, we celebrate every scar, every root, every truth. You are not too much. You are just enough. I realized that surviving wasn't enough anymore. There was a deeper calling I hadn't listened to in the early days of struggle. Every scraped hand, every tear shed in silence, every day I had been told I was invisible, had built inside me a responsibility I couldn't ignore. I wasn't just working to eat, I was working to be seen. And now that I had a space, a small corner of the world where my voice mattered, I wanted to make sure others like me could be heard too. It started small. I began inviting a few immigrants I knew through work to the back of the restaurant after shifts. We'd sit on the floor, share sandwiches I made, and talk about struggles, about dreams, about how no one had told us it was possible to survive with dignity in this country. I would listen more than I spoke, and slowly they began to open up. Names, stories, families left behind, dreams postponed, pain hidden. It was astonishing how many people carried wounds invisible to everyone else. Wounds born from the simple act of being a stranger in a place that didn't want you. One evening, I found a young man crying behind the dumpster where he had been hiding. He was 17 and had fled his country alone. No papers, no family, no place to sleep. I invited him to stay in a spare room I had rented cheaply, just a small corner with a cot and a lamp. We made rice and beans together. He told me how he had been working 12-hour shifts for pennies, how his boss threatened to call immigration. I told him that wasn't the life he had to accept. I didn't promise it would be easy, but I promised he wouldn't face it alone. That night, he slept on a real bed for the first time in months, and I realized I could turn survival into something more meaningful. I could turn it into refuge. I started connecting with local community organizations. There were nonprofits I hadn't known existed, programs offering free legal advice, ESL classes, emergency food boxes, and small grants for people trying to start businesses. I became a bridge, a translator, a guide. I walked with people to city offices, helped fill out forms, explained complicated letters from landlords and banks. Every success, no matter how small, felt like a victory against the system that had tried to erase us. A victory not just for them, but for every version of myself that had been ignored or humiliated. One Saturday, we organized a small pop-up dinner. Everyone cooked something from their home countries. Haitian griot, Salvadoran pupusas, Mexican tamales, Dominican pastelitos. I led the kitchen, coordinating dishes, teaching others how to present and serve. Over 50 people came. They ate, laughed, shared stories. Some were crying, some were hugging strangers who had become friends. I looked around and felt a sense of purpose I had never known before. This was more than food. This was community. This was healing. I also started mentoring a few of the younger employees from the restaurant, teaching them techniques I had learned, telling them the mistakes I had made, showing them that being good at dishes wasn't enough, but being relentless in learning and growing could change their trajectory. One young man, Antonio, kept asking questions about opening a business. I walked him through my notes, my spreadsheets, even took him to the community kitchen I had rented by the hour. Seeing his excitement reminded me of my own early days. The first time I realized I could cook something more than a meal, I was passing the torch. The more I helped others, the more my own wounds healed. Each story I heard, each hand I held, each smile I received felt like the universe whispering, "This is why you endured." I was no longer just Miguel, the dishwasher. I was Miguel, the person who created a space where others could survive, thrive, and remember that their lives had value, that their labor had meaning, that their voices mattered. I was creating a ripple of dignity. Sometimes, when I walked home alone at night, I remembered Jason. I thought about how he had tried to define my worth, and I smiled quietly to myself because he had no idea what I was building. And I didn't need him to see it. My life had shifted. My purpose had shifted. I was no longer waiting for validation from those who had tried to erase me. I was giving it to people who had been told they didn't deserve it. If you have ever wanted to help someone whose pain mirrors your own, whose struggle reminds you of your past, leave a comment that says, "I lift others as I rise." Let it be a promise. Let it be action. And if you want to follow along as we continue to build spaces where dignity and survival meet, subscribe to the channel. Every story shared, every hand offered, and every life touched makes the world a little less cruel and a lot more human. The restaurant was quiet that evening. The last orders had been served, the clatter of dishes slowly subsiding, and the hum of the refrigerators was the only sound left in the kitchen. I leaned against the counter, hands still damp from cleaning, eyes tracing the paths where I had walked countless times. It was strange to think that just a few years ago, I had entered this very space with my head down, invisible, carrying nothing but fear and exhaustion. And now, I could move freely, with my shoulders back, my heart steady, my name intact. I was finally standing in the place I had fought so hard to deserve. Jason was here too. He still worked in the same building, wiping tables at a side station. Our eyes met briefly. He looked away quickly, as though afraid to acknowledge what had shifted between us. But I didn't need him to see. I knew the truth that could not be erased by insults or dismissal. I had survived everything he thought could break me, and I had done so with dignity, with purpose, and with the fire of my ancestors guiding me. He was still part of the building, but I was no longer a part of his story. I was my own. I walked past him, quietly, and felt the weight of every struggle lifting a little more. All those nights, I spent cold and hungry. All the days I endured humiliation. All the moments I believed I had no worth. They had led me here. Not to revenge, not to dominance, but to life reclaimed. I had learned that victory is not about seeing someone else brought low. Victory is about standing tall while the world has tried to bend you. Victory is about creating something enduring in a space that once sought to erase you. I turned to the kitchen and looked at the team. They were busy prepping for the next day. Some were joking, some humming quietly to themselves, some focused intently on chopping and stirring. And I realized that what I had built wasn't just a small corner of opportunity for myself. It was a place where others could grow too, where young immigrants could see that perseverance matters, where people could taste the pride and memory infused in every dish, where survival could transform into purpose. I had become a bridge, a teacher, a guide, and a witness to lives being rewritten alongside my own. The city outside was alive. Lights flickered along the streets. The distant hum of traffic reached through the kitchen windows. And I thought about everyone who had touched my journey. Claudine with her quiet gestures of kindness, Ruben who gave me the chance to lead, Elijah who taught me the importance of starting small, every co-worker who had shared their story with me. Every act of grace, no matter how minor, had pushed me closer to the person I am now. Every challenge, every insult, every night of doubt had forged resilience. And I knew it was not just my story. It was the story of countless people who are overlooked, underestimated, and silenced. We rise together. We survive together. We belong together. I closed my eyes for a moment and breathed in the air of that space. It smelled like rice and spice, like sweat and effort, like memory and hope. I felt grateful. Grateful for every lesson, for every hardship, for every hand extended to me when the world turned its back. Grateful that I had learned to honor my roots, my family, and my own strength. Grateful that I could sit here tonight, fully present, fully alive, finally free from the weight of others' judgments. And now, as you watch this, I want to thank you. Thank you for being here, for listening, for witnessing this journey. Thank you for valuing stories of resilience, for allowing yourself to feel the weight and beauty of a life reclaimed. And if this story has moved you, if it has reminded you of your own strength or inspired you to help someone else, I invite you to continue. Click on the next video that will appear on the screen. Let it guide you further into stories that lift, heal, and remind us of the power of survival. Each story is a spark. Each story is a step. And together, they light a path forward. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this journey. And thank you for believing that every life, every struggle, every voice matters.